This episode of Brains on Games will talk about Undaunted Stalingrad, a deck building game set in World War II. Welcome to Brains on Games. I'm Dr. Brian McDonald. In this episode, we are going to talk about a World War II deck building game. This one has campaign elements, and honestly, it was the winner of a poll that I put up a week and a half or so ago because I've received a whole pile of games in the mail, and Undaunted Stalingrad was the one that got the most votes in terms of the game that people wanted to hear about the most. Here is the box for Undaunted Stalingrad by Osprey Games. This is a huge, giant box because it's a campaign game, so there's a whole pile of pieces that came in this thing. It's a game that takes between 45 minutes and an hour to play a scenario. It's for kids age 14 and up, and it's a two-player game, so you can't play 3 or 4 players with this one. It's 2 players only. Let's take a deeper look at Undaunted Stalingrad. Undaunted Stalingrad is a deck building game, but you've also got a board that's made up of these tiles, and they're representing different areas of the city of Stalingrad. This was, I think, the bloodiest battle of the Second World War, and you're playing the Germans versus the Soviets. So one player will play the Soviets through an entire campaign, and the other player is playing Germany. It's medium in terms of its complexity, and like I said, you can play a game in about an hour. And in terms of winning, the goals are scenario specific, and some scenarios will have different mission goals depending on whether you're the Germans or the Soviet players. This is set up for the very first mission, so I'm not spoiling anything by showing you anything that's on this board, and I won't show you any of the more advanced units or cards that you unlock as you go through the campaign. One of the neat things about this campaign game is, although your deck changes and you're going to have casualties and cards that you're not allowed to use later on, you don't destroy anything, you don't put stickers on anything, so everything can be reset without needing to buy extra cards or an extra board or anything like that. There are plenty of tiles. You saw how big that box was. There are plenty of tiles, and there are a whole bunch of different scenarios in the box, but tiles, as you go through the game, you may be able to destroy some areas of the board and change their layout. So things can change over the course of the campaign depending on what you do. It's a branching campaign because you've got these, well, this is the map book that shows you how to lay out the tiles for any given scenario. But each player, the Soviet player and the German player, also have this scenario book that tells them what units they're going to have available to them, what their starting hand is, what their mission goals are, and there's a little story, a briefing that goes along as you go through the game. So you read one section of text, and then it'll tell you, well, this is what you need to set things up for this particular scenario of Undaunted. Each player is going to have a supply of cards that they can pull into their deck. You've got a 4-card hand, and what you're doing is playing the cards from your hand in order to either give orders to your pieces that are here on the board, or to draw cards into your hand, or to draw cards from your supply and put them into your deck. Each of the cards has a few orders that you can give or actions that you can take when you play those cards, and the riflemen tend to be among the most important ones because you're going to want to play those rifleman cards to eventually get the rifleman over to your objective, because the riflemen, those are the guys, at least at the beginning of the game, those are the guys, the only ones that can control an area of the board by flipping over that little scouted token and showing that you're in control. You're drawing cards from your supply into your deck. You're using those cards to give these pieces orders in the game. Sometimes you're going to be shooting at the other players. It is a war game. So for example, one of the best combat options at the beginning is your machine gunners. And what's neat about them is that they get to roll 2 dice, and they're 10-sided dice in this game. They get to roll 2 dice if they're just trying to attack and inflict casualties, but they can also do suppressing fire, which just flips over the piece that they're shooting at so that it's got these stripes on it. And that means that the piece can't take any actions. The next time you play a card with this logo on it, Rifleman A, you just get to flip it back over. They can't do anything else. So they're sort of frozen in place until you do something with it. That is a super powerful action in the game, we found, And really great that the machine gunners can do that because they roll 4 dice for suppressing fire because they're not trying to kill anyone. They're just trying to freeze them in place so that they can't do anything. When you roll those dice, your opponent is going to have a defense value depending on the tile they're on and how far away they are, how much cover they have. And you roll a 10-sided die. Equal to or higher than that defense value is going to be a success. Doesn't matter how many successes you get. If you roll a 10 on the 10-sided die, you automatically succeed. But otherwise, you're just trying to get at least one success in order for that action to be successful. Because it is a campaign game, there are things that carry over. Like I said earlier, you might destroy some of the tiles on the map. That's not something you can do in the first scenario, but there might be casualties. Your machine gunners or your riflemen might be firing at their opponents and inflict some casualties. And that might mean that they're going to permanently lose a card from their deck. Now, there are replacements. You can get reinforcements into your deck because you need a certain number of riflemen or else you're not going to be able to do the control action that's going to allow you to move towards victory in the next scenario. But the reinforcements tend to be weaker than the cards they're replacing, so they might have one action less, or they might only be able to fire at a certain range on the board, for example. You also get to upgrade some of your cards, so your cards might become veterans after a particular scenario is finished. You'll draw a couple of cards that are going to be replaced by cards that are more powerful, that maybe have a more powerful action or have something extra that they can do when you play that card. So things gradually evolve over time. You start out, there are some tiles here that say you can't drive tanks or vehicles into them. You don't have any vehicles in your supply at the start of the game. So those are things that get unlocked later on. What skills are you working on, though, when you're playing a game like Undaunted Stalingrad? Well, one of the things when you're talking about a board like this and they have certain tiles that are your objectives and there's an area control element to it, you are working on those spatial skills. You need to figure out in this game your soldiers, your units can only move through squares that your scouts have already scouted out for you. So they have to have that little symbol, the binocular symbol on them, or else you can't move that way. So you have to have a scout. The scout has to move through that space, and then your riflemen or your machine gunners can move there. So you're doing this spatial problem solving here with the board, but you're also thinking about probability. How likely am I to draw one of these cards into my hand? Are there so many in the deck that that's going to slow me down? I'm only going to get 2 actions instead of 3 next turn. How close do I need to be before I'm likely to succeed in suppressing or attacking an enemy soldier? Because, you're rolling those 10-sided dice. If you've got 4 chances, you might be able to roll 7 or higher if you've got 4 chances. But if you only have 1 die to roll, the rifleman only gets to roll 1 die. So it can be very risky. So you are thinking about probability both for your card draws. What cards do you want to put into that deck to make sure you're drawing the ones that you want on any given turn? We did find sometimes there was this card, I had the rifleman and he's just in the right place, but the space wasn't scouted yet and I couldn't draw a scout card to save my life. So I couldn't move the scout through. So that slowed me down for a couple of turns while my opponent was whittling away at my forces. Each scenario too, though, is a puzzle for you to solve. You've got an initial setup. You can't see the whole board here. There are Soviet soldiers that are way, way down at the bottom. On the way I set this up, I played the Germans when we started this game. So each scenario is set up as a puzzle for you to solve, and each player is going to kind of change your options through the actions that they take. On top of that, as you go forward in the game, you'll have certain cards or units that are more valuable than the others that you really have to be careful about. You might be reluctant to risk them. So because you're solving a new puzzle each time, you're looking at the pattern of how things are laid out on the board to determine what are you going to do next. You might have to adjust your strategy on the fly because each scenario is a new thing with different goals. And if you're being flexible in your problem solving, if you're using pattern recognition skills, even your understanding of probability and using that to solve problems, those are all examples of fluid reasoning, that flexible problem solving, working with incomplete information, applying what you learned in one way to a novel scenario, right? All of the scenarios are novel here the first time you play through the game. So fluid reasoning is another skill that you're working on here. And finally, you are, of course, playing through these campaign scenarios in a city that's really in the world, set in a time and a battle that really happened. So there is an opportunity here for discussion and maybe to do some research about that Battle of Stalingrad that lasted 5 months. I really didn't know too much about what happened on the Far Eastern Front when the Germans went into Russia, other than the fact that their soldiers were so cold they didn't get very far. So I didn't know a lot about that. I knew more about what was happening in Italy, what was happening in Africa. I didn't know too much about what was going on in Russia. So I did do some reading because the story here is an interesting one, and it is, like I said, the bloodiest battle of World War II. So you've got that idea that maybe you're going to spark some curiosity or some discussions, or encourage a teenager to do some research in terms of, you might even do some research to figure out, well, what might happen in the next scenario so that you can plan ahead a little bit to play against your opponent. Final thoughts about Undaunted Stalingrad. This is a very thematic war game with a campaign where it's tense to begin with. I will tell you, when you're rolling those dice, and if your opponent's rolling the dice and they're trying to shoot or suppress your soldiers, you are on the edge of your seat waiting to see what's going to happen. Especially since we are playing a campaign game and there are long-term implications if you lose some of these pieces. You do get more attached to those soldiers as they get upgraded. You're more attached to the veterans, I think, and you're more careful about those. And we found ourselves, as we were playing, a bit reluctant to put some of those cards into our deck because we didn't want to risk losing them when we weren't really sure whether we had a good chance to win the scenario or not. So we were trying to be really careful and cautious with those veterans. We didn't want to waste them because we were attached to them. And so it's extra tense the further along you go. You get units that are unique, that you don't have a large number of them, so you don't want to lose them, especially since you risk losing them permanently. So it's thematic and it's tense. Every die roll, all of your opponent's moves are interesting. There's never enough cards and orders and actions to do all the things you would like to do. And it combines area control, the strategic part of a board game, with the deck building mechanism. And I'm not a fan of deck builders. I wouldn't list them. We've talked about trick takers. We've talked about dexterity games. I love both of those. Euro games. Another game that sort of combines a strategic board game with some deck building elements would be Concordia. And that's one of my favorite games of all time. But the deck building is not as prevalent, I guess you would say. It's not as traditional of a deck building game the way that Undaunted is, because you do have cards that you're trying to get rid of here in this game, but also the cards are units that get lost. And so, like I said, it's thematic. I like that this is a campaign game, but it's one where you don't destroy or deface or mutilate your cards in any way. It hurts my heart to buy a game and then have to tear up cards or deface them in some other way. So the fact that this is one where you can just reset everything when you're done, and maybe in a few months come back to it or play with a different player or loan it to a friend who's into these kinds of games. So you've got this real, I think it's very clever. It's a streamlined mechanism of combat where you're counting your distance in the cover and you're rolling those dice for success. I think it's easy to grasp what you're doing here once you get an idea of what the orders do. It's not too hard to figure out the rules, but there's still strategy, and it's a tense, fun game to play. There's some randomness because you do have those dice rolls, but you can mitigate it to an extent by placing your counters in a place where it's less risky for them to take those shots. Are there downsides, though, to Undaunted Stalingrad? Well, I mean, there are maybe a few. I would say that the artwork on the cards is great. The characters on the cards are great. They have little names that are written in cursive, like their signature, but the tiles themselves are kind of samey. They don't look a lot different from one another in a way. Well, I mean, you're sort of looking at almost like a satellite image of a bombed out city. So thematically, that does make sense, but it is kind of hard to distinguish one from another. It's a good thing that the tiles are numbered. It would be very hard to figure out which one was which if they weren't. They do fit together like a puzzle, so you've got like a railroad that runs through. You may not be able to see that on the camera, but it's not the graphics on the tiles are not super appealing, I would say, and they don't distinguish one from the next. You're not going to be talking about necessarily Pavlov's house here because it's just a nondescript brown roof that you can see. There's nothing else about the tile that makes that stand out other than there's a name printed on it. In some homes or some families, the limit of playing at a two-player count might be something that interferes with the enjoyment of the game. If both of my kids were home, I couldn't play this with both of them because it's a two-player, not a three-player game. And a concern that I haven't played through every single scenario in the campaign, but one concern that I have, and this might be more risky depending on who you're playing with and how those games go, is that later games in the campaign might be less balanced because of things that happened in earlier games. Maybe you've lost some of your veterans from earlier missions, and so you don't have the more powerful cards where the other player does have them. Maybe some area that you needed for cover has been destroyed, and you don't have the same degree of cover that you would have had on that space otherwise. So it's possible that the later missions might be a bit less balanced. You might really have to puzzle out how are you going to win it. One player might be at an advantage over the other. But I have to say, this is, other than Concordia, which is one of my favorite games of all time, this is definitely the best deck builder I have ever played. It's so smooth and tense. And everything about it, other than the satellite pictures on the tiles, it just calls out to be played again. I'm surprised I'm not playing it right now, but my partner in crime is working today, so I'm here to tell you about it. This is a fantastic game that really is evocative. It's so thematic. Every single card play, you're watching the other player. What is he going to do? I just really, really enjoyed this game. It's my first time playing an Undaunted game. They've been on my radar for a while, but because the deck building mechanic isn't my favorite, I waited until now where everybody was talking about the campaign elements. And when I heard about that, I thought, well, listen, maybe this is the one that I'll try. This is the evolution of the Undaunted franchise, maybe. So we really, really like this game. If you like World War II style games, you're limited to choosing between, the Soviets and the Germans. You don't get to play the Allies, maybe. But if you like World War II style games, if deck building is something that you're into, if you like the area control mechanic like there is here, if you like campaign games where you don't wreck your stuff, this is perfect in all of those areas. So Osprey Games has really knocked this one out of the park. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can leave them in the comment section below the video, or you can email me at brian@brainsongames.ca. Brainsongames.ca is the website. That's where future episodes will go. The previous ones are up there already. Brains on Games is the Twitter handle and the Facebook page and the Instagram feed, so we're all over the place. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to be notified of future ones, you can head on over to YouTube and click that subscribe button. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you next time.